Welcome, guys. So after the agonizing disappointment of the most recent release and the shoddy conclusion to a 10-year-long story, I've had a lot of feedback from you guys about how disconnected you've become, how uninterested you are, how this is the death knell for the game, and so on. I've had some people remarking they've never seen me so negative, and well, while in bed last night, it got me kind of wondering, what have the worst moments of Guild Wars 2 been, and how exactly would I rank them? In my video assessing the recent patch, I pointed out a tweet I made referring to some Season 1 content. I talked a little bit about the Zaitan fight, but I've had a lot of people wondering exactly how I rank these things. So that's what I've done. I've made a tier list, the best of the worst moments in Guild Wars 2. This is going to be a run through history and kind of depressing, but in another way, it also kind of puts a new perspective on the events of today. I think it's going to be interesting. Let's see what we've got, and I'm really curious to hear what your tier lists are down below as well. Thankfully, as someone who's dedicated their professional life to covering the game the past 10 years, I can remember quite a lot of big moments, things that may have even slipped your mind, and may have affected you a little differently to me. I won't spoil where the events of today and the death of Primordus comes in this list, but I can tell you that is not at number 1. You'll have to see whether you can figure out what number it is before it appears. So let's run through, starting at the bottom of the list, and these ones low down I've not really ordered so precisely. When we get into like the top 10, I've been pretty careful about their positions. Starting at the bottom of the list, number 17, I'm going to put down the pre-Heart of Thorns content drought Mordrum invasion patch. So for those who don't know about this, while Heart of Thorns was in development, much as during the development for End of Dragons, ArenaNet was kind of crunched. They kind of threw a ton of people on it, and it left the game, as it was currently getting patches, really kind of bare bones. There wasn't much going on. One of the only saving graces for this period of time was the introduction of the specialization system and a ton of balance updates. But as far as actual story content things to do, it was very thin on the ground, until finally we had a release that was all about the new Elder Dragon Mordramoth attacking a couple of places, like around Brisbane Wildlands. You could get a special currency to trade for items, and overall it was really underwhelming. You've got to remember, we'd already been fighting Mordrum the whole way through Season 2. There was very little special about it, and I remember there being some real backlash right around now over this. I don't count, for what it's worth, the post-Heart of Thorns content drought, so to speak, because there was a gap before even Season 3 started up. Many of that may factor into some of your lists. I don't count that, though, because there were raid releases there. I don't even really think of that as a drought. It's just people who absolutely refused to raid were left with no content, and based on your preference, you know, maybe that factors in as a bad time. The post-Heart of Thorns content drought as well did have a pretty big controversy for me. That was the revelation they wouldn't be getting all the Gen 2 legendary weapons going. Remember that? Felt like a massive slap in the face, so I'll put this around here. Coming in at 16, I have Living World Season 2's The Dragon's Reach Part 1 and The Dragon's Reach Part 2. The event whereby Season 2 was stalled midway. During this time, the player base of the day was used to very regular patches. Short patches, as far as the Golden Path is concerned, very regular ones. And after Season 1 concluded, a big selling point of Season 2 was, first of all, that the quality would jump up, which it did, but that the releases would come every 2 weeks, extremely rapidly. People were desperate for stuff to play, and they were desperate for consistency, particularly as other games right around this era, looking mostly at Final Fantasy XIV, were starting to find their stride with post-release updates, and Guild Wars wasn't. Season 2 sounded like a godsend. It was going to fix all the big issues people had with Season 1. Except they only got 3 of them out before the Dragon's Reach Part 1 released, and it was, much like this recent patch with Primordus and Jormag, extremely short. Barely any Golden Path content in it whatsoever, and an unfortunate announcement from the studio that they were going on hiatus because the schedule was too fast for them. They couldn't keep up. We had an unexpected break, and the release was split over a kind of awkward gap. People lost faith in Season 2 big time on this one, and any kind of hope that the devs probably had Living World would clear itself of the negative reputation it had built during Season 1 was squandered at this point, and I think to this day, it still hasn't really shaken that reputation. Coming in at number 15, I have something about the writing. On my tier list, it's not just patches, but also decisions that the writing department has made. And we're looking at Season 1 here, the handling and revelation of Scarlet Briar, the ultimate nemesis of Season 1. You know, I was really hoping to be super invested in this plot. I was really hoping that the foundation of the Molten Alliance and the mysterious stranger in the cities was accounting to something brilliant, but really it turned out to be a character I just wasn't that invested in, and it's a shame because the voice talent behind that character was so highly regarded in my mind. As far as Guild Wars 2 critique goes, I look back on that second half of Season 1 as the Mary Sue era, where most people who dared to comment about the story and their dissatisfaction from it just had to use the phrase, Scarlet is a Mary Sue. And I think it's the unfortunate quality of Season 1's antagonist that meant a lot of people were sort of vaguely interested, tuned out, and didn't take the rest of any of this seriously. To tether this criticism to something real, the main issue with Scarlet was the reveal that this fairly insignificant second-born Sylvari was actually a genius who had been everywhere and spoken to everyone and learned everything and knew the great secrets of the world. Yes, ultimately the reveal that she was being pulled by the strings of the mysterious Mordramoth and the transition into the eventual Heart of Thorns stories were handled well, but Scarlet was not a credible or buyable character, and so much of Season 1 revolved around her being exactly that. Number 14. Season 3, Flashpoint. Speaking of characters that I can't buy the things that they do, Flashpoint was an interesting patch in that it dealt with really major subject materials, surprise surprise, Jormag and Primordus, even going as far as depicting an Elder Dragon in a Living World patch, something very bold that the devs even pulled off, but had the unfortunate downside of dealing with a major world-bending event that was just figured out by the relatively naive, and again, realistically insignificant character, Taimi, who through her own genius has managed to put 2 millennia-old Elder Dragons to sleep. People talk about Taimi being overused, Taimi being too smart, Taimi ex machina, but really, when I properly look at the story, there was only one big moment that Taimi properly jumped the shark, and it was here with her dealing with 2 Elder Dragons because of Asuran technobabble, and what was it they suggested? She just wasn't getting much sleep around then, working around the clock? And what about the fallout from this event? In this one moment, Taimi has basically become every bit as prominent and important a hero to the world as the commander. Dealing with 2 Elder Dragons, the societies of the Norn and the Asura should be praising her for no longer having to deal with this threat. Shouldn't the Norn already be talking about reclaiming their homeland before Path of Fire? But no, the devs don't treat this massive moment with any reverence. We don't get any of that story material until later in the Icebrood saga, which basically ignores that it happened. Number 13, we stay with Season 3 to talk about the last patch, One Path Ends. One Path Ends is a really weird one in that it wasn't originally scheduled. The devs thought we would be going from Flashpoint straight into Path of Fire, but then because the expansion itself needed a bit more time, they ended up doing One Path Ends as well and realized they had a bit of breathing room to tell whatever story they liked. And since Season 3 had led us to believe we were dealing with Lazarus and then turned out it wasn't Lazarus, they decided now was the perfect opportunity to quickly have him come really to life and kill him. A story that really deserved more time than one patch and really basically screams of the devs just wanting to close doors. This happens a lot with Guild Wars 2, where previous stories that could be expanded on and explored in a deep way instead feel like they're being snipped off. One of my favorite releases ever is the Bastion of the Penitent, but is guilty of the same thing. You've got a big story, but you just know by the end they're gonna kill Saul. They're gonna finish this plot off because really, our internet don't strike as interested in this stuff, or aren't confident, or don't have the budget to really go deep with anything that was set up a long time ago. This wasn't the only awkward fit about One Path Ends. What about the fact that this was basically a human-centric story, particularly the stuff with the Shining Blade, that is now one-size-fits-all being thrown onto a bunch of characters it's inappropriate for? I don't know anyone that was playing a Char or a Norn or one of the non-human races that particularly relished any of the story to do with the Shining Blade. Just another one of the big problems of Guild Wars 2. The characters we're associating with, and even the commander themselves, tend to not act like one of their races, and for One Path Ends, this came to a head in a really ugly way. Number 12, we're going back to pre-release here with the launch trailer and the marketing of the game that ended up as an inscrutable live-action mess. The launch trailer for a new MMO, I would argue, is a pretty important beat. The devs did very well with the marketing before this. The first trailer was excellent, the manifesto really captured the MMO community of the day and brought a lot of fresh new eyes into being interested about Guild Wars 2. And then, with the final big one, the launch trailer itself, they were teasing on Twitter that it was live action, they had actors and actresses that were actually doing something. What possibly could we be seeing? Was it going to be a CGI cutscene in parts, just like we saw with the Guild Wars 1 original trailer or the Factions trailer that was so beloved by the community? Was it going to be a real in-universe story showing a live-action Destiny's Edge, following in the footsteps of what Bungie did for the marketing of Halo Reach and Halo 4? Well, no. It's a strange art house thing that seems to have been contracted out by some other company, vaguely based on the idea that Guild Wars was going to break the mold. So here, let's have a lot of macro shots of people in plaster, resulting in something in the end that, if anything, looked just kind of patronizing. Oh, we will have a little bit of gameplay though, right at the end, as we transition into a shot that spoils the appearance of the Elder Dragon that they've spent 3-4 years teasing and hiding from us. Presumably was the main reason a lot of people wanted to play the main story, to actually see. Well, sorry to disappoint you, you've been spoiled on that right at the last moment. What a weird trailer. It's not that the launch trailer was so bad for me, it's that it could have been and should have been so good, which is one of the first blips in this game's marketing, and leading unfortunately to a lower player base than this product has ever deserved. Number 11, we're over to Season 4 with Long Live the Lich. A controversial release, and something I'm rather split on, because I do feel that this episode did a lot of things very well. Path of Fire released with an amazing concept. It wasn't just Dragon v God. It was the story of an area of the world in which 3 great powers were vying for control. Dragon, God, King. And what did we see of the King? In the expansion itself, we saw the influence of Palawa Joko in a great many and meaningful ways, and I actually applaud the unexpected story beats with him trapped in the mists and the commander fobbing him off during the actual expansion. When it came to the Living World subsequent though, I really wanted to get some real good Palawa Joko story, and not just because of my expectations of the character from Guild Wars 1, because they had set him up and actually done him so well here in Guild Wars 2. Through episode 2, they were still basically dancing around the fact that he was off screen and people didn't really know what was going on with him. And finally, in episode 3, where we can get into the meat of the Palawa Joko story, Palawa Joko, an ally or an antagonist I expected throughout the whole season, worthy of the finale of that season, got shoved aside and killed real quick. Now again, his final cutscene actually I think was done rather well, but just as I mentioned before, this patch reeks of the devs not having the time to really dig into the stories. Palawa Joko had to die now, even though we haven't got into enough meat with this story, because guess what? Kraukatorik's got to die in another 3 episodes, so this is what you get. A real disappointment, and even just a couple of weeks ago in my story montage where I replayed that beat to people, my comments were filled with people upset that Palawa Joko didn't get more and the opportunity had been squandered. Long live the Lich, my ass. Moving in to the top 10 now, lowlights of Guild Wars 2. I take us back to launch and one of the biggest affronts to what the game proposed it would be. I'm talking about the personal story cop-out known as the Pact. Prior to Guild Wars 2's release, the devs have been talking a lot about how RPGs were not satisfying players, particularly in MMOs, because they didn't respond to the choices you made, that you would just be on rails and you couldn't impact the world. To that end, they had many ideas, dynamic events being one of them, the personal story being an area of the game in which you would experience branches based on the choices you made that had consequences was a big one. The entire setting of the world was about disparate races making different decisions for themselves, and 3 orders among them too that operated independently, and you would choose which ones you belong to. Everyone has their own thoughts and feelings and even plans to deal with the Elder Dragons. And what did we get? Well, a little bit of racial story, which then condenses into a little bit of order story that you rush through at lightning fast speed, until eventually the ultimate cop-out of them all, the Pact, is introduced, distilling the personal story into what essentially becomes one plot thread that is always destined to end the same way. I tend to think Traherne gets an unfair rap by the community. People find a mentor within their order and end up really enjoying them just to have it suddenly replaced with Traherne. But you realise Traherne was never the problem. It was this decision to make the Pact, it was this decision to collapse everything into one storyline and rush you out of the orders and rush you out of your home area as fast as possible. I could talk for hours about issues I have with the launch game and the personal story. The poor utilization of the personality system and its eventual removal is kind of tangential to this exact issue. But this big ticket item here sits real high on my list. The Pact and what it represents, the betrayal of a world in which your RPG decisions have consequences, is a real affront to what I expected from Guild Wars. At number 9, we have Heart of Thorns, and the fact its scope was way too small to tell the story it had to tell. Heart of Thorns robbed us of a lot of stuff that really should have been there. There really should have been more Foul Lane. There really should have been more Air before she died. There really should have been a Nightmare Court story. And I don't just mean the mysterious appearance of Duchess Chrysantha and the removal of a path in Dragon's Stand, but the Nightmare Court and their interplay, how they feel different and strive for freedom to regular Sylvari, is a plot thread that really would have flourished in a world with Morgemoth around. A lot of people talk about Malik and the fact that he didn't appear in the expansion. To that, I'm a little more forgiving. That's a side story they always could have left till later, maybe even up in End of Dragons. But what about the fact that Heart of Thorns never properly explained how we were going to defeat this Elder Dragon? The issue of Deus Ex Traherne, where we can just happen to go into his dream suddenly and that definitely will kill Morgemoth, but we have to take Traherne out, was so hastily manufactured. What about the fact that Heart of Thorns never actually had an epilogue? And even to this day, while it kind of has one through the Caladbug story arc, it's something buried in achievements and you'll probably only do on one character out of order when you've sort of forgotten the rest of the Heart of Thorns storyline. Overall, I would say Heart of Thorns represents a massive de-escalation of the scale of the world. Core may have done things wrong, but it did feel like a real struggle, a real theatre of war and battle against an Elder Dragon, in which we starve it, cut off its supply lines, know its motivations and territory. Morgemoth? We just kind of stumble around as a couple of people in the jungle, and then he's dead. The game's never really recaptured that sense of scope that came with launch. Season 4 got kind of close, but Heart of Thorns was pretty disastrous. Number 8, worst moments and decisions for Guild Wars 2. I take us back to Season 1 and to a certain extent Season 2. The introduction of the Dragon's Watch characters to shamelessly replace Destiny's Edge. Now this could have been handled more tactfully. We could have slowly had these new characters join the cast, slowly rotate the old ones out in something of a more organic way. But the way that Season 1 was written kind of felt like a bunch of new writers came in with their own fan fiction ideas of their favourite characters, and they wanted to be on screen instead, and they were the special ones instead, with no real reason why Destiny's Edge disappears. This was one of the big reasons why people started tuning out of Season 1, and I appreciate it may have had to have been done because of the voice talent they'd chosen for their main characters at launch was going to cost a premium for the way that they wanted Living World and story to be delivered in the future, but the implementation was just too clunky. The reason this is still so high on my list is because Season 1 can't even be replayed anymore. So new people are still joining this franchise, going through the whole core story and learning to enjoy these characters of Destiny's Edge. God forbid they read the novel dedicated to them, and then suddenly are thrust into the start of Season 2 where they're pally-pally with an entirely separate cast. A cast that is in many ways no more interesting or compelling than their predecessors. On the rare occasion that we do still see the original Destiny's Edge interact with the new group, I do think things are handled quite well. Obviously, Ritlock has been in both groups, and at least we've got that. I think Logan's been done well, but the question, for example, of where the hell is Zodja, or should Air really have been killed off so quickly in Heart of Thorns? Hey, what's Garm up to, even to this day? These are things that I wish I never had to wrestle with. For number 7, I have pre-Living World Season 1, but post-launch, Fractals of the Mists. Now, I want to be clear, I like Fractals, I play them, I think they're a force for good in the game at this point. However, what I'm talking about is the original release of Fractals just a couple of weeks, basically, after the game originally came out, in which they were filled with clunk and actually sparked one of the most massive backlashes and controversies and exoduses of players that I've actually seen in all these years covering this game. Why? ArenaNet had spent many years previous to the launch of Guild Wars 2 telling us that there would be no gear grind, that level 80 was the max level, that the gear that we got, that would be it. They had pandered to a bunch of burned out MMO vets that were used to being baited and switched, lied to by studios, and were cagey about whether Guild Wars 2 really would be different. Weeks after release comes Fractals of the Mists, with, guess what, a new tier of gear to go for that would be harder than the old ones, and a complicated sounding infusion system that was nothing but a gear grind. This was an update that was obviously released because the devs hadn't adequately balanced the access of exotic gear and dungeon tokens and rewards from World Comp, and perhaps driven by NCSoft or higher up, they realized that they needed something to keep people playing, because if you weren't going for a legendary, there basically was, as people love to say around this time, no end game to Guild Wars. But the way that they delivered this in Fractals, especially the way they explained Fractals to the community, sent people into a frenzy. This was an especially depressing time for me because I could kind of see that it wasn't as bad as people thought it would be. I did trust the studio wouldn't be adding more tiers after Ascended, and to this day they haven't. But the grim reality is that this moment, the handling of this release, slashed at the Guild Wars 2 population levels during those crucial times right after launch where they need to encourage people to stay and the game won't be a flash in the pan. I think as soon as this release occurred, I never heard anyone call Guild Wars 2 a WoW killer ever again. Oh, and I do take issue with one thing. I think they should have kept going with dungeons. Now that Fractals are in, they're probably the better place to focus developments, but new dungeons to explore in Living World updates and so on, ones that are better tuned and establish their philosophies about the Trinity and so on, would definitely have been my preference. Coming at number 6 for the worst moments for Guild Wars 2, I have one very recent, the Icebrood Saga launch announcement. At the end of Season 2, right there in the patch, there was a bonus cutscene, an Easter egg cutscene, that revealed there was going to be an expansion for Guild Wars 2. The first expansion. How exciting. The same thing happened with Season 3. We were going to be getting Path of Fire, and in fact Path of Fire's real release was coming super soon after. So when Season 4 ended, the expectation was there'd be another expansion. But there was no teaser this time, and we were all kind of left hanging. That release, All or Nothing, was in January 2019. 1 month later, in February, 143 people lost their jobs unexpectedly at ArenaNet. So clearly something was up. It wasn't until August 30th, way later in the year, that we finally got some news. People were starved to figure out what was coming in the new announcements, which turned out to be the Icebrood Saga. Not an expansion, but something that was expansion-like, except they didn't show any expansion-like features. And other things the community have been waiting on for ages now, like World vs. World alliances, weren't really being shown either. And they spent most of the time on stage trying to sell Funko Pops and other merchandise. And it wasn't a particularly interesting venue. And the numbers their live streams pulled for the announcement were cripplingly low, way lower than we'd seen Guild Wars 2 ever get before. And they clearly hadn't worked on anything past even the first map yet. They had very vague concepts and ideas for map 2. Yeah, I think it's fair to say the Icebrood Saga is leaving with about the same vibe and atmosphere with which it came. A deeply depressing time. Once again, I do want to express my sympathy about the layoffs. The question will always be though, why wasn't an expansion being worked on during Season 4 just as one had been worked on during Season 3? Whatever the answer is, a lot of players haven't stuck around to find out. At number 5, and congratulations to anyone who guessed this, 5th worst moment for me with Guild Wars 2, the Icebrood Saga Champions finale, Primordus and Jormag are axed. The events of the current story, which rapidly hand-waved and delivered no decent bar of quality on the conclusion of some plotlines that have been in the making for 10 to 12 years now since Primordus' first introduction, is really one of the lowest points I've experienced in this franchise. It's not at the top of the list, but it's pretty high. I won't waste my time excoriating them over this again. You can check out my dedicated video on it that I did just 2 days ago. So what's higher on the list? Number 4, in my opinion, we're back to Season 1, about a year in, and Feature Pack 2, the new player experience, and the Chinese launch. For those that don't remember it now, around the Season 1 days, the main Living World patches would progress the story, and the devs developed this concept of a feature pack, which would be a release all about quality of life, system changes, item updates and new areas of the user interface and engine upgrades that would improve the general experience and quality of playing the game. Now, in truth, I really like the feature packs, and in the preparation of today's video, I went back and read some of the things that they added. This is stuff like the wardrobe getting implemented, and many of the things that really round the MMO out as feature-filled and able to compete with the other MMOs in the West of today. Except, we don't get feature packs anymore. The devs stopped doing them after just the second. Why? A massive backlash. Feature Pack 2 contained within it the concept of a new player experience. In essence, it was a smart idea. A release that goes back and looks at the leveling experience and modifies it to hopefully encourage player retention and make the game better. This is something the game desperately needs to be happening on the regular. But nearly every change implemented was utterly incompetent, an unnecessary U-turn on a philosophy they've established as enjoying in the past, or something fiscally corporate as though it's there to encourage you to use the gem store a bit more and at least get a little bit of money out of you before you leave. The new player experience and Feature Pack 2 was actually implemented right around the time the game was being ported to China, something that took significant developer attention away from progressive, decent updates for the main MMO here in the West, as they tried to recalibrate it for those markets and again deal with retention. Now, it's never really been confirmed, but it's always been a personal theory of mine that the truth is the new player experience is as wonky and as crappy as it is because they basically just took a bunch of the Chinese changes and slapped whatever ones they could over into this side of the game. Maybe all this money and time and effort would have really been a great thing for Guild Wars 2 and boosted its popularity, but it didn't. The Chinese version of the game has suffered a great many issues and basically is not popular whatsoever. During one of the big PvP tournaments, Worlds, which would pit the EU residents versus North Americans versus Chinese, had a Chinese team in the finals so poor they were dying to the PvE mobs on the Forest of Niflhel. That's not a sign that the Chinese players were bad at the game, that's a sign that the population was so low and so few of them were even there to engage in the PvP. They had absolutely no one to form a single 5-man team with any level of competency. A waste of time, a waste of money, and during a critical period of Guild Wars 2's life where Season 1 had to deliver. And what do we get for it? A crappy feature pack that actually takes stuff away from the game, and a backlash to which convinces the devs for the next 5 years they should never pursue updates like this ever again, meaning some of the biggest issues this game suffers from haven't been fixed and probably never will be fixed. Good luck with a Steam release, I say. This discussion leads me nicely into number 3, absolute lowlights of Guild Wars 2. We're at launch, and the fact that the Heart of the Mists and all of their PvP was later admitted to be basically just a glorified beta. What a lot of people don't remember about this franchise at this point, and don't care about this franchise at this point, is that Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2 were slated to be were heavy PvP games. If you read the Making of Guild Wars 2 art book that came with the collector's edition of this release, they state that 1 in every 3 developers at ArenaNet that made Guild Wars 2 considers themselves a hardcore PvP player. And Guild Wars 2 was supposed to satisfy for hardcore esport PvP players. Guild Wars 1 had already been an industry leader in the esport scene for its day, and particularly around 2012, in the heyday of games like StarCraft 2 and the emergence of the MOBA scene, this was a big deal. So naturally, when Guild Wars 2 came out, of course it didn't have any infrastructure for real esports competitive gameplay. Of course the tournament system was broken. Of course the balance was all over the place. Of course there was a limited variety of maps. Of course there were no real prize pools. But don't worry, they will encourage serious esport organizations to look at the game, which they did, and then of course all ran away. I seriously cringe looking back to some of those pre-release or right after release moments where big teams from other games are taking Guild Wars 2 seriously as an esport, only for all of them to quit. The fact they didn't immediately rally around this stuff leading up to that first Christmas and make serious changes, that we didn't get a proper ranking system until well after Heart of Thorns, is brutal. And even then, the initial league ranking system wasn't a real ranking system. And when Season 5 did come, already by this point probably too little too late, and I do hate that expression, it came paired with the Chrono Bunker meta. I don't think many of you watching this video will really respect how high I've put this on the list, because the people who are naturally still here engaging in discussion about Guild Wars 2 and talking about it are not the GVGers or the Heroes Ascent players or the Team Arena players from back in the day. They're not the people that watch the Cologne live streams and the big tournaments from before, but this could have been, should have been, one of the biggest parts of this game. And them botching this is honestly a bigger issue to me than any story beat they may have mishandled with the Elder Dragons. Really. At number 2, who's wondering what this could be? I'm going to have to go with launch again and the Ruined City of Arras story mode. Now, let's be clear, I'm calling this a Ruined City of the Arras story mode issue, but in all reality, it's kind of a broad issue about the general gameplay tuning of the personal story. I've already talked about the betrayal of its structure and the fact it didn't really respect any of those player decisions and just boiled everyone together. But what about the fact that the personal story isn't a real game to play? That they spread out so many instances and bit off so much more than they could chew that you don't get anything compelling? What about the fact that most people were too bored by the personal story to actually beat it when the game came out? I remember watching YouTube videos from right around release of prominent people playing Guild Wars 2 near the end of the story, not realizing that their skills weren't even hitting because they were out of range. And it doesn't matter because the game's just that easy. All coming to fruition with a beautiful climax, the entire game built around fighting this Elder Dragon turns out to be pressing 1 on a cannon. Not only this, but random clunky cutscenes are stitched together, clearly showing there were supposed to be more phases of the fight that the devs had just thrown out. What was it the devs had said to us so much between 2008 and 2012? They didn't give us a release date. Why was that? Because they would only release when it's ready. Zhaitan and so much of the personal story was not ready. Why is all the storyline around the recapturing and establishment of Fort Trinity so pathetic? What about that story in Ore where there's this amazing risen hunter that's stalking all your allies who does literally no damage and you can accidentally kill? Why am I able, especially with the help of a bit of power creep in the subsequent years, to beat the entire game without ever using a skill? No, I'm serious. I once AFK beat the entire plot all the way up to Zhaitan just because I was ranged with a pet that did everything for me. The videos on the channel you guys can watch. This is such a slap in the face to real gameplay. I appreciate that successful MMOs want to appeal to wide demographics and have to a certain degree pander to the lowest common denominator, but this isn't satisfying, not to anyone. How low do our standards have to be? And in all these years, they still haven't fixed the Zhaitan fight. Why? Because the metrics don't show many people really experience it in the first place, and art comes second to company metrics. What a disaster. If I could go back in time and make one change to Guild Wars 2, encourage the devs to not make one decision and change the future of the entire game going forwards, I would tell them to end the personal story for launch at Claw Island. And Season 1 and all the subsequent updates should be about delivering the Ore arc properly. That would have given the game a real sense of direction immediately after launch and would have helped a million of the other issues that are lower on the list. Well, there is one issue that maybe would have helped, and if I could go back in time, maybe this is the thing I should change instead. So here we have it. Number 1, the worst decision ArenaNet ever made, the absolute lowlight of Guild Wars 2, the thing that did the most damage, in my opinion. It's Season 1, Flame and Frost Prelude. And really, Season 1 as a concept in general. Now, I mentioned this on my video about Prime Orders and Jormag earlier in the week, but I really do view Season 1 as a complete disaster. You gotta remember that during Guild Wars 2's development, they had assigned a small live team to the original game that produced content called Guild Wars Beyond. That was essentially Guild Wars 1's living world, and in that, they snuck random little updates into a basically dying game that some astute, observant players noticed, and it created a lot of hype and a lot of fervor, and it really worked well for the audience of Guild Wars 1 as the game was closing out in its twilight years. When it came to Guild Wars 2, I think the devs were a little bit too excited about the success they'd seen in Guild Wars Beyond and thought they could do the same. See, remember, at the start of Season 1, they weren't real gameplay patches. It was stuff like a refugee camp appearing, or a corpse randomly appearing in the Wayfarer foothills, or steam vents exploding. Mysteries that we presumed would eventually build into real content, but it occurred too slow. The game had already been out for 6 months by this point, and instead of learning from what the other MMOs were doing, continuing to refine their end game, telling story through dungeons and raids, obviously Guild Wars didn't have raids, ArenaNet turned their back on all of that, and they went pie in the sky. They thought that they could deliver a real, dynamic, unpredictable, living world where expansions wouldn't even matter anymore. No boom and bust of population. We'll just have it all. The game will be constantly updated. Updates don't even need to stay in the game because it's all about what's happening here and now. We're going to simulate a real virtual world purely through new updates. A crazy concept. And I gotta admit, I admire how gutsy and ballsy they were with this. They just tried to reinvent the wheel with the base game and seen a lot of praise from that with the MMO manifesto video. So why not try and reinvent the wheel of MMOs having expansions in the first place? Living World Season 1 couldn't do any of that. And when the devs finally realized they needed to do some kind of release where there was real content to play, we had the disaster of Flame and Frost, the prelude to which was a tiny patch in which, after months of sitting around doing nothing, South Sun Cove and the Fractals of the Mist notwithstanding, people were told to fix signs. That was it, the whole patch. Press F on some signs. And you even got a title, the volunteer title, just for doing that. You should have seen the absolute zergs of players desperately waiting for the patch, entire maps filled up across all servers, Guild Wars 2 at one of its highest moments of population, only for all of them to be disappointed. And then the agonizingly slow months following as they tried to find their feet. Season 1 did pick up in the second half, but by that point, they were already working towards an end game, another break, and Season 2, so we never really saw the vision be realized. Season 1 was a massive gamble that I wish the devs had never taken. It burned the devs on creating unbelievable amounts of content that would just disappear. It burned the gaming press that were being asked to create articles about minor stuff eventually nobody would click on. And to this day, since Season 1, Guild Wars 2 doesn't get much of a look on major gaming press sites. It killed development of Guild Wars 1, which up until the initiation of Season 1, the Guild Wars Beyond team had been planning on returning and doing skill balance. We could have been living in a world where both games were being delivered together, and it killed our prospects of getting endgame developments, like actual work being done on the dungeons and what was clunky about them, or proper new dungeons coming in with Living World Season 1 itself. Born from this came Guild Wars' reputation as a game for casuals that doesn't care about endgame, which was never true and never the ambition, particularly if you look at the way that they handled GW1's endgame and updates like the Domain of Anguish or the trickier dungeons in Eye of the North. Not to mention the fact it encouraged the devs not to get work on an expansion soon enough, resulting in the Heart of Thorns delay and 2 content droughts surrounding it, depending on your opinion of those raid releases. I'll remind you that right around launch, we had comments from the devs on the record saying they would be working on an expansion, right there in 2012 after release. For the first several Living World Season 1 releases, I was convinced that was what they were doing because that is what they had said. And of course, they never revealed that they'd gone back on that idea at some point when they realized how much they were underwhelming people with what they were able to put out. And even worse, to this day, we can't even replay it. It's undermined the idea of having a game based around a story because new people who come in don't get the full story. The idea of actually being able to interpret Living World Season 1 as a total noob to this day, you're going to need some serious hand-holding from a veteran. And even then, as I've mentioned already, you'll probably hate a lot about Season 2 and the sudden introduction of a new cast. There was a lot of wobbly stuff around Guild Wars 2's release, but I really believe that the Season 1 decision is the one thing that did the most irreparable damage to this whole franchise. So there you have it. That's my best of the worst. Those are my Guild Wars 2 lowlights, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing them. It's interesting going through everything all together. It does kind of help put this week into context and help me get over this week to a certain degree. You know, there's been a lot of... And it's funny to me that basically all of this stuff on the list you can go back and hear me ranting about at the time. There are a lot of things that I haven't included on my list that maybe some of you guys are thinking of. I do want to sort of wrap through these real fast. Just some shout outs maybe you guys think of, or maybe they're just too small. So like some story beats that personally I don't mind, but I know people dislike. Aurene dying and coming back to life, a lot of people might consider. The Commander dying and coming back to life in Path of Fire. A lot of the Path of Fire story beats are really messy when you put them under serious scrutiny. Ritlock in the Mist as an arc, if you really analyze it, it just falls apart. The library scene kind of falls apart. The Path of Fire decision to kill Vlast instantly, and his story is told after his death. A lot of people I know don't like that. The decisions they made with Bram's character and his grief over Air, you know, when they basically forgot he's a Norn. So they just wrote him like a human. And then in interviews afterwards where they try to justify the story as good, they blatantly say, oh, but, you know, he's acting like a human. It's like, that's the point. That's the problem. Also, there's the whole wolf totem thing that they ignored. There's the Icebreed Saga's character assassination of Smoder. I personally think the first 4 parts of the Icebreed Saga are pretty good, but Smoder, I really didn't like their handling of him. The Requiem Ritlock story, probably, if I'd gone to like 20 points, that would have appeared for me. You guys know I have issues with that. Some other stuff, non-story stuff, that you guys might consider as lowlights. The first patch with mount licenses in the gem store, Mountgate, and their sale of those and the RNG. The build template release. A lot of people had real issues of that and their pricing of those, the triple dipping in the gem store. Maybe that's on your list. Disneyland recreation of Lion's Arch, I know really gets to some people. The implementation of the Desert Borderlands, the World vs. World tournament stuff and disappearing. The lack of alliances is probably on some people's list. One of the biggest controversies this game ever had was Heart of Thorns daring to charge $50 and bundling vanilla in. But if you already owned vanilla, you didn't get a discount. So people freaked out about that one. Remember that? There's a whole don't pre-purchase Heart of Thorns thing. There was a ban wave around launch for people who bought Karma weapons. You could buy really cheap Karma weapons, put them in the Mystic Forge and sell the items and kind of generate crazy money. A ton of people got banned. That was a huge controversy. The discontinuation of Super Adventure Box, maybe some of you guys really loathe. There was the cheat engine thing and the spyware, you know, where they basically banned your account if they saw you were using cheat engine, even if it had nothing to do with Guild Wars 2. Like, I used cheat engine for my Final Fantasy series, and if I'd logged in on Guild Wars 2 the wrong day, I would have been accidentally banned. And, you know, maybe even illegal spyware practices. That was a big controversy. What about the marketing gaffes? The bubble tea, Quiznos, the mysteriously missing Volkswagen Beetle giveaway. Why didn't we ever see who got the car? The taxi cab campaign, of course. And then there's some other ones, you know, like the post-Heart of Thorns content drought. Maybe you hated that because you hated the idea of raiding. A lot of people did. You might not be listening to my voice at this point, but people left around then. Wings 1 to 3, that is. Some people thought that was the golden age. For some people, maybe Wings 6 and 7 are their lowlights because they were so easy to beat. So, yeah, those are some other things. They're not really on my list, but stuff to think about. There you have it, guys. The best of the worst. This video's ended up a lot longer than I thought. Amazing. If any of you guys managed to listen the whole way through, let me know what you think, and I'll be around very shortly for a balance update. So see you guys there. I really want to hear your comments on this one, guys. Let me have it. See you next time.